This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. As winter winds down and the skies turn blue again, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, are you looking for a writing workshop to turn your storytelling into your superpower? I'll be announcing my spring schedule of workshops soon, including theme, backstory, and suspense. The short story is a form different from the novel and worth knowing and writing in if you want to really hone your prose. This week, you can still sneak into the memory, emotion, body workshop, so enroll today to explore the power of your own experience in creating prose that connects your characters with your readers. This special workshop is offered for pay what you can, as little as $20. Hello and welcome to Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about what goes into a scene. Little potato, little carrot, little onion, some vegetable broth, little garlic.
Saute for 10 minutes.
Right.
Sprinkle with cheese. Bake for half an hour.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there you go. But there is you joke about that, but there is a recipe really that it's worthwhile following, especially for people who are new to writing, that they may feel startled or even gratified that there's a map that you can follow that's going to help. Mm-hmm. And if you do all the basics, then you'll get a scene that in theory should work. It may not be the literary masterpiece you first want, but in first draft mode, nothing's like that anyway, really. But unless you're already a literary master, but
but if you are, why are you listening to a craft podcast?
Yes, why aren't you knocking on our door saying, "Can I come on and tell them how it's really done?"
Right, exactly.
Yes.
So what goes into a scene? Well, we know we've got a beginning and an end of a scene.
And a middle. Yep, beginning, middle, and end. I mean, really, the scene should look like a mini Freytag's pyramid. The arc of the scene is like a miniature within the arc of the chapter, which is a miniature within the arc of the book. Now, that said, that sounds formulaic and monotonous. So the art is to vary it and have ups and downs and deal with mood and to make it art and to not have it be a single static thing. But the scene is a building block within your chapter. That's really at its core all a scene is.
Yeah, I think formulaic it's fine if you look at it in meta, because if a sculptor is going to make a sculpture, then they're going to start with a block of stone and they're going to chisel it, and it's no different really. But no two sculptors are going to deliver the same work of art, but they're both going to start with a piece of stone. They're both going to have chisels. So realistically, we're hanging everything on the same framework that everybody hangs things on, where for most of the Western world, in terms of the way we understand story structure anyway. So it makes sense to start with the basics. You don't build a bridge across a river by saying, you know what, I'm just going to start from the top downwards. It's just some things just don't work.
Right. So I'm going to raft out into the middle and then
see how it goes.
Pole in the mud. Yes. Yeah. No, if we think of a scene in terms of theater, it might help us visualize what we try to do on the page. So in the theater, the stage is in front of the audience. And in a book, the stage of the page is in front of the audience. And enter actor, stage right? So somebody enters the scene, or the lights come up and somebody is in the scene and action occurs. So we, as a reader, are privy to something happening on the stage of the page. And there's going to be the introduction phase of the scene, the rising phase of the scene, and then the peak of that dramatic action and the end of the scene. And depending on the scene, the setting, how many entrances and exits there are, you could have multiple scenes in a chapter, or you could have a single scene that comprises the whole of the chapter. So this building block has a certain shape, but it can be size-wise, it can be smaller or larger depending on how many transitions you need within the larger unit of the chapter. Because if you don't need transitions, if everything is happening in one place in one time frame, and the characters come and go, but we don't have, setting changes, we don't need scene breaks for time jumps or anything, you could have a single scene chapter, but it's still going to introduce the action, rise the action, peak the action, and end the action for that chapter break.
Yeah, so you're talking about some sense of flow there. There's a sense that something is moving. And that's, I think, as a reader, that's what we expect. We expect that the scene moves the story along. And I was talking on yesterday about years ago when I first read Robert McKee's book Story, and I wasn't writing at all. I was curious about it from a corporate training point of view, because we were teaching people how to tell stories in the corporate world, as opposed to being very, I had been doing that for years, as opposed to delivering dry presentations. I found it quite eye-opening that something that should have been such a blinding flash of the obvious, really, if I'd have sat down and thought about it, that he was saying, well, that the purpose of the scene is to move the plot forward, and if it doesn't, then it shouldn't be there. Oh, duh, And so I started watching movies after that, and I would occasionally just, yell out, "That scene did nothing to move the story forward," because it was just,
how dare they?
And you think about making a movie and the expense and the time taken to even create, 10 seconds of airtime. Why did somebody think that was that important if it didn't really move things forward? Maybe it was a darling, they were attached to it or whatever. So I think I like what you said there, Alida, about, there's something that kicks it off, it rises, it falls, there's change, there's movement. We expect movement. And that's where exposition can really fall down, because it's, to use your metaphor of the analogy of the stage, it's like the curtains stay closed and the director comes out and I just want to tell you a little about how this scene came about. Back in 10 years ago, just get on with it, open the curtains, please. And I think that as a reader, that's what we want. We want the curtains to open, we want to get involved.
Yes. Yeah. And, I think it's worth noting too that the thing that moves the story forward is not necessarily a plot thing. It isn't necessarily action driven. So it might be the character, it might be the theme, it could be an emotional note, it could be, right? So you do need to advance the story.
Yeah.
But every scene is not going to be an action scene. It doesn't have to be driven by action. You can have some very quiet scenes that advance the story powerfully.
Yeah, you and I probably talk about plot differently. I refer to plot as what is the story's elements, that go from beginning to end. So, but yes, if you talk about plot as in terms of, what are the sort of mechanical elements that things turn on, yeah, totally agree. Yeah. There'll be internal elements of character and emotional rising and falling.
I think for me, it was kind of a breakthrough to realize that a scene really only had one thing in it. Like it focused on one thing. It was simplified down to one little moment of whatever it is, right? You're developing this, you're moving forward this. Not that it doesn't have other elements in there, but there's a focus, right? And whereas a chapter often will have multiple, especially if you have multiple scenes in it, but to be able to say, okay, in this scene, what is happening? And I'm looking for the one thing that's main, right? Like focusing on this development or this development. And then I can sort of spin the rest of it in without feeling like I've overwhelmed the scene, if that makes sense.
Do you have a for instance?
No, not off the top of my head. I was doing this on the paragraph level and what I'm currently doing, because it's a short story, right? Where I realized I was overpacking my paragraphs with, okay, hold on. I think like a paper, like every paragraph has to have its topic, and then it expands on the topic, not necessarily like, oh, we're going to talk about this character and then this character, and then we're going to shove a little setting up in there, and then we're going to pack it all together and say, oh, there's a paragraph. Like, it doesn't make sense. It's confusing and it stops achieving the purpose that it was there for. So, but you can expand that and say the same for a scene, right? It needs to achieve the purpose it was set for. And sometimes we can overpack that. Oh, I need to have something happen with this character and this subplot and this thing happen here and this happens here. And I need to describe this here. And it's like, okay, but just focus on what the main point of that scene is. Where's that climax? Where is it leading to? What is the thing that is changing, right? Not necessarily the multiple things that are changing in that one scene.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The idea of focus is really important for the scene, but also for the chapters, because we place the breaks where shifts occur. And the bigger the break, sentence, paragraph, scene, chapter, the more significant the shift is. And so it can be a shift in setting and time or place, but it can also be a shift in dramatic action, a shift in meaning and the reader's understanding, a shift in the emotional notes in the story, the emotions that the character is experiencing, for whatever reason. While you were talking, Kathryn, Anne of Green Gables came to mind, and I know I've talked about it before on the show, because there's a scene that I use sometimes when I'm teaching where little Anne Shirley is brought home to meet Marilla Cuthbert. And so she's brought into the kitchen, and here's Marilla, the spinster. And she's like, what? I thought we were getting a boy from the orphanage. And Anne Shirley is just yakking away and being Anne Shirley. And Marilla is talking to her brother Matthew over Anne's head about how this orphan has to go back because we need a boy to help with the farm work, right? And so you've got these two conversations, and then Anne just deflates as she realizes what's happening to her and this decision that's being made. And at the scene break, Anne is sent to bed. So she gets to spend a night in this lovely bedroom in the gable, because she's a girl. She doesn't have to sleep in the room off the kitchen. So we've got that shift in setting, right? And we've got all of that horrible realization happening through this discussion of sending her back through that scene. And that is the focal point. It's hope stashed, and then up in the bedroom scene, before the chapter breaks, we're in a different emotional space as well as a different physical space with this character. And so that the action of the day ends with her crying herself to sleep, right? But Marilla comes up to see that she's going to bed, not really to tuck her in, because it's not a motherly scene. But as a reader, we see this little exchange, and, our hope might spark again. And anyway, for whatever reason, Anne of Green Gables was coming to mind as like, oh yeah, here's an example of that container and the focus and the action and the emotion and all of those elements working together really beautifully to drive the story forward.
Yeah, and there's no, because we talked at the start about beginning, middle, and end. And end doesn't necessarily mean closure. So, there's no closure for Anne in that scene. The scene closes, but the story is moving. So I think it's important to recognize that you don't have to tie things up neatly at the end of a scene. And in fact, I would argue that you want almost to do the opposite, because every reader wants to know what comes next. And so, we're looking at all sorts of different ways to keep that going. It could be melodrama, it could be dramatic irony, it could be, rising and falling emotion, it could be a sudden jump cut where we just go, what's going to happen, or it could be, as you said, Alida, just a tiny interchange that says, is there a flicker of hope here? What's going to happen? Is she going to be able to stay, or is she going to go back to that horrible orphanage?
Yeah. And this is where the ending of that scene where they're talking about her and then they send her up to bed, right? That's really important that it ends there with that emotion not finished, right?
Yes.
So where we're still sitting in that emotion, because you don't want to leave the reader feeling, oh, that was the whole letdown, like, right? Oh, the end. You want to go, oh no, now she's in bed, right? So it's that tension that we're maintaining through the end of the scene, right? So that's where we need to be aware of where the beginning and end of our scene are, so we don't lose the tension that we are creating in the reader.
Right. And the scene concludes action in one way, but then, as Robert was saying, you always have some open-ended element to carry us forward into the next scene. So the conversation in the kitchen ends, and Marilla's not going to budge because she's Marilla Cuthbert, and that's as final a decision as you're going to get out of this scene, right? But there's this question of, where is the child going to sleep? And Marilla had prepared the little room off the kitchen for a boy, but for whatever reason, it's not suitable for a girl. So Anne gets to go up to the guest room. And in a way, it's more tragic. It's sadder, because if she were in the space off the kitchen, it's so like servant-y feeling. And what Anne wants, and what we know she wants, is a family and a home. She doesn't want to be a scullery maid. And so the fact that Marilla sends her up to this lovely little bedroom on the upstairs floor where she and Matthew sleep, it just deepens the heartache for Anne, and therefore for the reader, and
it ups the stakes for the antagonist as well, because now they haven't placed, it's not going to be so easy for them to, well, it was just a kid in a servant's room they can dismiss. Now this is someone they've invited into their lair, their part of the house.
Yeah, and those emotional notes are so important to a story. That emotional note of Anne's disappointment and her deflating as the scene with Marilla progresses. That's one note. But then that bedroom, which is all about the setting. It's all subtext. Wow. That's like the icing on the cake, except it's really bad, sad cake.
Or you don't get to eat it.
Yeah.
It's the cake that you want, but you just get to look at and smell.
Yes, exactly.
I like scenes like that, clever juxtaposition, because if we talk about everything that goes into a scene, and ideally, you don't want to have same type of scene as well. That, again, that's a bit of a trap you can fall into, I think, especially for me when early on I was writing action stuff, and it was just action. And then my early beta readers, or alpha reader probably, saying, do they ever get to sit down? This kid's only 13,
Yeah.
Because I was writing middle grade, or I think she was 11 actually at the time. How do I keep that up? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's important to have that rhythm of the highs and the lows, of action, of emotion, of, keeping the story flowing and giving it room to breathe, and the characters room to breathe as well. And so you should look at your scenes and say, okay, we've just been in a really high, tense, dramatic scene, whether it's action intense or emotionally intense. So let's have a breather, right? Let's not just go from all this dialogue in the kitchen of voices and disappointment. Now let's see Anne in the bedroom, cuddling under the comforter, but crying And so we do get that rest before the next day when the sun's up and the farm's bustling and Marilla's loading Anne into the wagon to take her back.
Exactly. So I think, again, we risk sort of sounding formulaic. Oh, you got to do this, then this, then that, then this. But realistically, you're, as an author, shining a spotlight on various aspects of a character's life or growth or, conflicts. So it's where you choose to shine that spotlight. And if you always choose to shine it on the same thing over and over, then the reader gets to predict what will happen next. And if they do that, the story becomes of less interest to them. So the interest is maintained when things happen that are believable, but, unexpected. And so, we get that Anne goes there and she's expecting to be welcomed, but actually they were expecting something completely different. So all the expectations are out of play. And then that's nicely juxtaposed by the fact that she's then sent to bed in a setting that she was absolutely longing for and may not ever experience again. So it's brilliant, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is.
There you go. Kids' books.
That's right. Yeah.
But that's why they're classics. Yeah. Classics endure because their scene work is so good. And we've all read books that realistically we know we've read them, but can't remember a single thing about them because they're popcorn. They might have been fun to read, but it's those scenes that put the character front and center, to call back to our character episode, that show rising and falling, that have momentum, and that lead us in unexpected places that are believable. That's why we read stories, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well said.
I plotted that all beforehand. I had a formula for that.
Of course. And it looked like a pyramid, right?
Yeah.
I think if you're confused about what kind of scenes you can get to use to get that like up and down ebb and flow, I think this is where you go back to your genre that you're writing in and you look at some basic scenes, right? Like, okay, they had a huge fight scene. Now what happened next? Oh, well, they went back and they got their wounds stitched up and they picked up more ammo so they could go to the next fight scene. But it happened, right? There was that moment of breather. Or, if you're having, I don't know, a romance or something, right? Where you have the high emotional moment of the meet, and then they go back and they debrief with their friends, or they go home and their home is quiet and alone, and they get that lonely feeling and they realize that they're ready for something new, right? So you have these ups and downs that you can kind of see scene by scene in literature that we don't always see unless we go looking for it, right? Where it's, okay, wait a second, you're talking about ups and downs, but I don't ever hear or think of any ups and downs in my, the books that I write or the genre that I read. You have to sometimes go looking for them to be able to understand where that moment is, where it changes the pacing.
Right. Because as readers, when we're really engaged with the story, we're just feels riding natural. The waves, and we aren't seeing it. We aren't aware of it. And so that's a really good point to go actually do a breakdown, do an analysis, take a book that you love, that you've already read or maybe read more than once, and just go through a chapter or three. You don't have to endure a whole novel that way unless you're enjoying it, but something you've already read for pleasure, go back and do the analysis. And when you pick up a book and it's not working and you're getting annoyed at it, that's a great time to do analysis, to go, okay, what is this writer doing that is not, not succeeding? Right.
Why do I feel so breathless? It's because we haven't had a break for 7 chapters and my character has a broken leg and a broken knee and they haven't.
It doesn't seem to even be bothering them.
They're still running a marathon tomorrow.
Yeah, they've been shot twice, and yeah. I think it's important to remember, because I had this experience when I first started writing, thinking that it was all meant to come out perfect the first time. So many of those classic works, there's a lot of scenes that are on the cutting room floor. or have been changed, and we know that from movies, because they'll release deleted scenes, or that you just know they made, or they'll release a director's cut and it's an hour longer. Go, yeah, and then you watch it and you realize why they never had included that first hour.
Or the people who really are fans enjoy it, right? But the people who aren't didn't need it, and that's the thing is if you didn't need it, you get rid of it. It didn't need to be part,
right?
Exactly.
So then you come back to the basic reason for the building block of a scene, which is it drives the story forward. It has a point, as you said, Kathryn. It has to do one thing. At its most basic. Yeah. There you go. What goes into a scene? Everything.
No. That's not what we said, Robert.
I feel like we always start these conversations like a scene, like duh, a scene, right? And then as we move through it, we're like, actually, just writing craft.
Yeah,
it's just, but it's so important to break it down and really talk about all those little details.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com. I know. So yesterday I came in here and I was typing manuscript pages, and Edie walked into the ballroom and it's all dark. And I'm like, okay, so the fixtures would be both gas and electric. So it's right about that period when things were starting to convert. And I was like, well, I want them to be the gas. So maybe they're just gas. I don't know. But I was like, how would she turn it on? So I started researching how gas fixtures were turned on. Like you have to start the flow of the gas, and some are keys and some are chains. And then you have to light them. But then, and I was like, I found like blogs about people renovating Victorian homes in Kansas. And I was fascinated, and I typed like a paragraph, and then I went down this rabbit hole.
Wait a second. This is a minute detail in my novel.
I know.
Maybe they should have just been electric.
Yeah. Like crap.